All right, get ready. Because today we are going to really dig deep into free market economies.
Yeah.
We're going to, figure out what they are, why they even matter, and like, explore all the, both the good stuff and the potential problems.
Right.
We've got some great sources lined up, articles from Investopedia, Merriam-Webster,
Oh, nice.
GoCardless, FinShots, plus a really interesting YouTube video from Study Wind.
Yeah, it's a topic that I think sparks a lot of debate. So having that diverse range of perspectives, I think, will be really helpful to sort of get a balanced view.
For sure. For sure. And you know me, I always love those real world examples, the kind that really bring these concepts to life.
Yeah.
One that I found in the FinShots article that really caught my eye was this whole thing about Indian companies, even big names like Flipkart,
Uh-huh.
choosing to base themselves in Singapore before eventually coming back to India.
Mm. That's such an interesting example. It really makes you wonder, is it just about Singapore being business friendly?
Mm.
Or is there something more going on there? Like, how does the way they structure their economy factor into all these decisions?
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we can figure all that out. But first, let's just get on the same page here.
Okay.
What exactly are we even talking about when we say free market economy?
Well, Investopedia defines it as an economic system where it's really supply and demand that are the driving forces with like very minimal government intervention.
Okay, so it's all about just letting the market do its thing without too much interference.
Yeah, exactly. And Merriam-Webster adds to that, emphasizing private enterprise
Right.
and minimal government restrictions.
Got it.
It's that classic idea of individual freedom and how it extends into the economic realm.
Less government, more individual freedom in the marketplace.
Right.
Okay. But you mentioned earlier that there's no such thing as a purely free market.
Exactly. Yeah. In reality, it's more of a spectrum. Some economies are closer to that ideal than others, but there's always some level of government involvement. It's helpful to think of it like a sliding scale.
Yeah, a sliding scale of economic freedom.
Right.
I like that. So what are some of the hallmarks then of an economy that's further along on that free end of the scale?
Sure.
What makes them tick?
Well, GoCardless gives us a pretty clear picture. One of the key characteristics is that the government doesn't really get involved in setting prices or production levels,
Okay.
or even things like employment terms.
So it's basically a free-for-all. Everyone just kind of does what they want.
Not exactly a free-for-all, but the idea is that businesses and consumers make their own choices based on what they're willing to produce or pay.
Right.
So supply and demand become that invisible hand that guides the market.
I see. So if people really want something, businesses will, pop up to provide it. And if nobody's buying, well, those businesses are just going to fizzle out. It's all about that natural equilibrium.
Exactly, yeah. Another key characteristic is that most goods and services are produced by the private sector, not the government. And private property ownership is also a big deal.
Yeah. It sounds like it gives a lot of power to individuals and businesses to shape the economy. GoCardless also mentioned this thing about freedom for financial institutions. What's that all about?
It means that financial institutions, like your banks and investment firms,
Uh-huh.
they also have a lot of freedom to operate without, like heavy government regulation. They can lend money, invest, manage financial transactions, with less red tape.
So less red tape. So it sounds like there's a lot of emphasis on individual freedom and autonomy, within these systems. But doesn't that raise some red flags? What about things like exploitation or just bad business practices? I mean, who keeps things in check?
That's the big question.
Mm-hmm.
And it highlights the inherent tension within free market systems, right?
Okay.
On the one hand, you've got this drive for freedom and individual choice. But on the other hand, you need some safeguards in place to prevent abuse and ensure fairness.
Right. Because unbridled freedom can easily turn into a recipe for disaster, especially if you have a few powerful players calling all the shots. I remember that YouTube video from Study Wind brought up a pretty stark example of this.
Oh, you're talking about the East India Company, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a classic example of how a company can exploit a free market system for its own gain, potentially at the expense of a lot of people.
Right. They had this massive monopoly, and it led to some pretty, negative consequences. It really makes you think. Even with all the potential benefits of free markets, there needs to be some kind of mechanism, to keep things from spiraling out of control.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's always that risk that a few powerful players will take advantage of the system and sort of squeeze out the competition. So finding that right balance between freedom and regulation becomes really crucial.
Yeah. Sound like a tightrope walk.
It is.
But before we dive into the potential downsides, I kind of want to flip the coin for a second and explore what makes these free market economies so attractive in the first place. I mean, there has to be a reason why companies like Flipkart were initially drawn to places like Singapore, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And both Go Cardless and FinShots highlight some pretty compelling advantages. One of the big ones is this consumer-driven innovation.
Okay.
When businesses have to compete for customers in a free market, they're constantly trying to come up with, new and better products and services.
Makes sense, yeah. It's like survival of the fittest, but for businesses.
Right.
They have to innovate or they risk becoming irrelevant.
Exactly. And with all that innovation comes another perk,
Hmm.
competitive pricing. So businesses are under pressure to keep their prices, attractive to customers.
Mm.
Otherwise, they'll lose business to someone else.
So it's kind of a win-win for consumers. They get more choices and better prices.
In theory, yes. And all that competition also tends to breed efficiency. Businesses are constantly looking for ways to do things better and faster to reduce costs and stay ahead of the curve.
Sounds like a pretty dynamic environment, and it's not just about established companies, right? What about the impact on entrepreneurship?
That's another big advantage that's highlighted in our sources.
Okay.
Free markets tend to encourage entrepreneurship and the development of new technologies
Hmm.
because there are fewer barriers to entry.
Okay.
You have the freedom to take risks and try out, new ideas.
It's that classic image of like the garage startup, right? That blossoms into a global giant. The American dream, but for businesses.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of appeal in that narrative.
Yeah.
And of course, all of this activity, the innovation, the competition, the entrepreneurship, it can all lead to significant economic growth.
Right. So that's the ultimate goal, a thriving economy fueled by the power of the free market. It makes sense why companies like Flipkart would be drawn to that kind of environment.
Yeah.
But let's not sugarcoat things. We know there are potential downsides to this model. What are some of the things that keep economists up at night?
Well, as you pointed out earlier with the East India Company example, one of the biggest concerns is that a system focused primarily on competition and profit. It can create or worsen inequalities.
Right, because if it's all about survival of the fittest, what happens to those who can't keep up?
Right. That's the question, isn't it? If you don't have certain safeguards in place, you risk creating a system where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that can have a ripple effect on society as a whole.
So what are some of those ripple effects? How does that inequality actually play out in people's lives?
Well, think about things like, access to education, health care, even basic necessities like housing and food.
Uh-huh.
If a large portion of the population is struggling to make ends meet, it limits their opportunities to improve their lives.
And that in turn can actually hinder overall economic growth, right?
Exactly.
It's like a vicious cycle.
If people can't afford to buy goods and services, businesses suffer. And if businesses suffer, the economy as a whole takes a hit. So even from a purely economic standpoint, addressing inequality is crucial.
So it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic one as well. It sounds like finding that balance between the potential benefits of a free market and the need to protect those who might be left behind is a constant challenge.
It is, and it's something we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into this fascinating and complex topic.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to shift gears a bit. We've laid the groundwork, we've got the basic definitions down, and we've started to grapple with both the promises and the pitfalls of free market economies. What do you say we take a closer look at some real-world examples to see how these concepts play out in practice?
I'm all for it. Let's see how those theoretical principles translate into real-world outcomes.
Perfect. Stay tuned, listeners, because in our next segment, we're going to be examining some specific cases, including those shining examples of free market success that you mentioned earlier, like Singapore and Hong Kong. We'll see how they've managed to navigate that delicate balance between freedom and fairness, and what lessons we can learn from their experiences.
Welcome back to our deep dive into free market economies. Before the break, we were talking about some of the potential downsides of a free market and how even with all the upsides, there are definitely risks involved.
Yeah, I think the East India Company example from the Study Wind video, really drove that point home. It's just a stark reminder that a system that's, designed to reward competition and innovation can also be exploited if the right safeguards aren't in place.
Absolutely. And one of the most, common critiques of free market economies, as highlighted in both the Go Cardless and FinShots articles, is that they can lead to increased inequality.
Right. We touched upon this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth unpacking a bit further. What does that inequality actually look like in practice? How does it affect people's lives?
Well, imagine a society where the wealthiest individuals and corporations have a disproportionate amount of influence and resources.
Mm.
This can lead to a situation where access to essential services like healthcare and education becomes increasingly unequal.
So essentially, those who are already well off have a significant advantage. And it becomes even harder for those from disadvantaged backgrounds to climb the economic ladder.
Precisely, yeah. And this gap can widen over time, creating a cycle of poverty and limited opportunities for certain segments of society.
It sounds like a recipe for social unrest. If people feel like the system is rigged against them, wouldn't that lead to frustration and anger?
It certainly can. And it's not just about social unrest. High levels of inequality can also have negative economic consequences.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, if a significant portion of the population is struggling to make ends meet, they're less likely to participate in the economy.
Right.
They might not have the disposable income to buy goods and services, which can stifle economic growth.
So it's not just a moral issue, it's an economic one as well. Addressing inequality isn't just about fairness, it's about ensuring a healthy and sustainable economy.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of a mixed economy comes in.
Okay.
Even the most free market economies, like the ones we'll be discussing shortly, they recognize the need for some level of, government intervention.
Okay, so it's not this like black and white scenario. It's not a choice between pure unfettered capitalism and complete government control.
Right. A mixed economy attempts to find a balance between free market principles and government intervention.
So what does that look like in practice? What kind of interventions are we talking about?
Well, it can range from things like, social safety nets,
Okay.
such as unemployment benefits and welfare programs, to regulations that ensure fair competition and protect consumers.
I see. So it's about creating a system that harnesses the power of the free market while also providing a safety net for those who might fall through the cracks.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting the vulnerable. Government interventions can also be used to promote, public goods like infrastructure and education that benefit society as a whole.
Right, because those are things that the private sector might not necessarily invest in on its own, even if they're essential for long-term economic growth.
Precisely.
Mm.
So finding the right balance between those two forces, the free market and government intervention is a delicate but crucial task.
It sounds like it. Well, speaking of finding the right balance, you mentioned earlier that we'd be taking a closer look at some real-world examples.
Yeah.
The FinShots article highlighted Singapore and Hong Kong as like prime examples of free market economies. What makes them so special?
Well, both Singapore and Hong Kong, they consistently rank highly in economic freedom indices, which measure things like property rights, freedom from corruption, and ease of doing business.
So they really embrace those core free market principles that we were talking about earlier.
They do. They have low taxes, minimal regulation,
Yeah.
and a strong emphasis on private enterprise. This has made them attractive destinations for international businesses, and has contributed to their impressive economic growth.
This sounds like the free market dream in action. But we also talked about the potential downsides of this model, like inequality. How have they addressed that?
That's a great question. And it's important to note that even these free market champions aren't completely hands-off. They do have some social safety nets and programs in place to mitigate the potential for extreme inequality.
So they found ways to temper the potential harshness of a purely free market system.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
They've implemented things like public housing programs, healthcare subsidies, and education initiatives to ensure that even those who might not be thriving in the free market have access to essential services.
It sounds like a pragmatic approach. They're not shying away from the potential downsides of a free market, but they're also not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Precisely. They're finding ways to harness the benefits of a free market while also addressing its potential shortcomings.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about us? What about India? The FinShots article mentioned that India ranks as mostly unfree on the Economic Freedom Index.
Right.
Where do we fit into all of this?
That's an important question. And it's worth noting that India's ranking on the index has been improving in recent years. However, there are still significant challenges to overcome.
Like what are some of the factors that are holding India back from, embracing those free market principles that seem to be working so well in places like Singapore and Hong Kong?
Well, one of the key issues is bureaucracy. India has a reputation for having a complex and often cumbersome, regulatory environment, which
Yeah.
can discourage businesses and stifle innovation.
Yeah, the infamous red tape. I've heard stories about, businesses having to jump through hoops just to get, basic permits and
It's
licenses.
a real problem,
Yeah.
and it's something that the government has been trying to address, but progress has been slow.
So streamlining bureaucracy would be, a good starting point.
Right.
What else could India do to create a more, free market friendly environment?
Well, investing in infrastructure is crucial. India needs reliable transportation networks, efficient energy systems, and modern communication infrastructure to support economic growth.
That makes sense. It's hard to compete in a globalized economy if you don't have the, basic infrastructure in place. What about education? We talked earlier about how inequality can limit access to education.
Education is absolutely key. India needs a skilled workforce to attract investment and compete in the global market. Investing in quality education, especially in STEM fields, is essential for long-term economic success.
So it's about creating an environment where, businesses can thrive, but also ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to develop, the skills they need to succeed in that environment.
Exactly. It's about fostering both economic growth and social mobility.
Okay, so there's a lot to consider. It sounds like India has the potential to become a major player in the global economy, but there are also some significant hurdles to overcome.
That's a great way to put it. And it raises some interesting questions about the role of government in promoting both economic freedom and social equity.
Right. It's clear that there's no one size fits all solution. Each country has its own unique, context and challenges.
Absolutely. And as we move into our final segment, I think it's important to keep that in mind. We've explored the theory, we've looked at some real world examples, and now it's time to sort of zoom out and consider the bigger picture.
Ooh, I like where this is going. So what's next? What are we zooming out to see?
Well, we've been focusing on individual countries and their economic models.
Right.
But what happens when we apply this free market lens to the global stage?
Okay.
What are the implications for international trade and global economic development?
Ah, the really big questions. I'm ready to dive in. Okay, so we're back and ready to sort of tackle that global scale.
Yeah.
We've been talking all about free market economies, and I think it's time to zoom out and see how these principles actually play out on the world stage.
Yeah, it's a fascinating shift in perspective, right?
Yeah.
We've been talking about individual countries,
Yeah.
finding that sweet spot between free markets and government intervention. But now we're talking about international trade and global economic dynamics.
Right. And we touched upon free trade briefly earlier, but I think it deserves a closer look,
Oh, yes.
especially in the context of this globalized world we're all living in. So, how does free trade fit into this whole free market puzzle?
So think of free trade as like the global extension of those free market principles, right?
Yeah.
It's about reducing those barriers to trade between countries. Things like tariffs, quotas, complex regulations, allowing goods and services to flow more freely across borders.
So it's like taking down all those economic walls and letting businesses compete on a truly global scale.
Yeah, it definitely can be.
Intense.
And the arguments for and against free trade are often heated. Proponents of free trade, they argue that it leads to, greater economic efficiency,
Yeah.
lower prices for consumers, and increased economic growth for, all countries involved.
So it sounds like a win-win situation. Everyone benefits from that increased exchange of goods and services.
Right, exactly.
But I imagine there are also some concerns, about just opening up economies to that kind of intense competition.
There are. Critics of free trade often worry about, potential job losses in developed countries
Hmm.
as companies shift production to countries where labor is cheaper.
Right.
They also point to the potential, for exploitation of workers from developing countries where labor protections might be weaker.
Right. And it's like that dilemma we were discussing earlier,
Yeah.
about balancing economic freedom with social responsibility. It seems like it gets even more complex when you're dealing with a global system where different countries have different standards and regulations.
Absolutely. And that's why the debate around free trade often involves Issues like fair trade practices,
Okay.
ensuring that, workers are protected and addressing environmental concerns. It's not just about removing barriers to trade. It's about creating a level playing field that benefits everyone.
So it's not just about free trade, it's about fair trade. I can see how finding that balance on a global scale is it's a massive undertaking. But it sounds like something that needs to happen, right? I mean, we live in a totally interconnected world. What are some ways to create a more just and equitable global economic system?
Well, one way is through, international institutions
Okay.
like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These organizations, they play a key role in shaping global economic policy and providing financial assistance to developing countries.
Ah, yes, those big players on the global economic stage. We haven't really talked about them much yet. How do they fit into this whole free market picture?
They play a complex and sometimes controversial role.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they provide loans and financial assistance to countries in need, but on the other hand, they often attach conditions to those loans, encouraging those countries to adopt economic policies that align with those free market principles.
So it's like they're using their financial leverage to promote, a particular economic model.
In a way, yes, and
Yeah.
that's where the controversy comes in.
Yeah.
Critics argue that those conditions can sometimes undermine the economic sovereignty of developing countries,
Yeah.
forcing them to adopt policies that may not be in their best interests.
So it's like it's a tricky situation, right?
Yeah.
These countries need the assistance, they need that financial help, but they also need the freedom to make their own economic choices.
It's a balancing act.
How do they navigate that tension?
It's a balancing act, and it highlights the importance of, developing countries having a voice in shaping those global economic policies.
Yeah. So it's not just about these big institutions dictating terms. It's about, creating a more inclusive system where all countries have a seat at the table.
Exactly, and that's where things like international trade agreements and forums for dialogue and cooperation, that's where they become really important. It's about finding ways to work together to create a global economic system that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Okay, so we've gone from, individual countries to global institutions and trade agreements. We've talked about, all the benefits and all the challenges of free markets on a global scale. But you know me, I always like to bring it back to the personal level.
Right.
What does all of this mean for us, as individuals? How can we even begin to make sense of these complex global forces and their impact on our daily lives?
That's the key question, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of all of it, these global economic systems. But I think the most important thing to remember is that, we're not just passive bystanders. We all have a role to play in shaping the kind of world we want to live in.
Okay, so what can we do? What are some practical steps we can take to become, more informed and engaged citizens of this global economy?
Well, for starters, stay informed.
Okay.
Pay attention to what's happening in the world, both locally and globally. Read those news articles, watch documentaries, listen to podcasts like this one, and engage in thoughtful conversations with people who have different perspectives.
Yeah, the more we understand about, how these systems actually work, the better equipped we'll be to make informed choices and advocate for change.
Exactly, and don't underestimate the power of your consumer choices.
Mm,
Every time you buy something, you're casting a vote for a particular company and a particular way of doing business. Support those companies that align with your values,
mm.
right? Whether it's fair labor practices, environmental sustainability, ethical sourcing.
Right, the power of the purse. I like it. So it's about being conscious consumers, staying informed, and engaging in thoughtful dialogue. It sounds like a good starting point for navigating this complex global economic landscape.
It is, and remember, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
The global economy is constantly evolving, and so too should our understanding of it. The key is to stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop learning.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to, wrap up our deep dive into free market economies. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic principles to the global implications. We've explored the promises and the pitfalls, the successes and the challenges.
Yeah, and I hope we've sparked some curiosity and inspired you to continue exploring this, this fascinating and ever-evolving topic?
Because ultimately, understanding how these economic systems actually work, both locally and globally, is essential for all of us. It's about, empowering ourselves to make those informed choices, both as individuals and as citizens of a global community.
It's about shaping a world where economic freedom and social responsibility go hand in hand.
Hmm.
Creating a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
Beautifully said. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed the journey. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the ideas that shape our world. Until then, keep diving deep, fellow knowledge seekers.